What a Wild Spirit Brings by Lil, Chapter 16. As soon as she awakened, she darted up, screaming, and for the first few moments didn't even know why. She stopped screaming, surprised at herself. Then Mitten's voice came, saying something she didn't hear. Mitten had left her. Mitten hadn't come back. Mitten didn't save her. She started shaking and holding herself and crying. Mitten reached to touch her, and she screamed and leapt from the bed, ran to a corner. Anything to get away, anything to hide as memory flooded in. She cowered, trembling, a huddled mass of terror in a corner on the floor. She started clawing at her head, trying to get the memory out. She couldn't stop hearing Demean's moaning and breathing and feeling those two claws ripping at her insides. She could still smell her, she could still taste her. She couldn't get her out. There was no telling how long she was like that before something finally broke through the chaos in her head. What stopped the suffering was the voice of the power. Something ignited when she heard her. If anyone could make it go away, the power could. Who did this to you? Lil looked up from her corner and saw the power standing there, with a face angry and sad and queenly all at the same time. Who? Lil couldn't speak. She was terrified. What would they do to Demeen? What would Demeen do to her? Little brave one, please answer. It is of the utmost importance. No! Lil wanted to tell her. It was just overwhelming how much he did. But she just couldn't. I was raped. I was held down by air and dirt and raped with claws of air that cut like steel. I was raped and your gift made it possible. Now use your gift and make it go away. Please, power, help me. Lil didn't mean to shout it any more than she meant to say it. She was at the woman's feet, begging, groveling, completely broken. She stared at the power's face, her own filled with pleading. The power looked sad, and then her face turned to stone. She turned away and told something to Mitten. Lil didn't hear anything after she said, "Get rid of her." She was raped by someone of the Haldani. The reputation of the Haldani was at stake. It hit her so hard that she couldn't breathe or move or think. She felt tears starting anew as she looked at the power's back, desperate to beg her again, but it would do no good. She just facilitated the winning of the war. She just had made friends with these people. She would have died for Demeen. How could any of them do this to her? Demeen didn't just take her virginity. Demeen didn't just take her dignity. Demeen took everything. The power left and Lil was glad. In one instant she came to hate the woman. Anger at the injustice began to overtake the memories. Fury surged through her pain and she slowly began to rise. She looked Mitten dead in the eyes, and Mitten looked like she was fighting hard to keep sorrow back. But through her almost emotionless face shone her glistening eyes and compassion. Lil, you... I'm going to say this only once. You have to run away. Now, while you can. Right now. Before the others get here. Take the boy with you. You are kindred spirits now. You and him. Go out the window. I will float you down to the stable roof below it. And you run. You run back to the Anthem, and don't you ever come back. If you do, they'll kill you, Lil. If you do, I will have to kill you. A tear escaped as she swatted it away, running to the closet and grabbing up Lil's Anthem gear. She threw it on the bed, pulled the blanket around it, tied a knot with 4 corners, and shoved it to Lil. She woke the boy who had been asleep, and he seemed glad to see Lil. You're leaving with Lil now, all right? Mitten Haldani said to him. You two will take good care of each other, won't you? She sounded like she was convincing herself more than telling him. She kissed his cheek and moved to kiss Lil's, but she flinched away from Mitten, glaring. The fire in Lil's chest was an inferno. It was good she didn't have the gift, or she might open the ground beneath the whole college in the hopes of them all dying together. Mitten Haldani's looked hurt by Lil's rejection, but she still picked them up with air and dropped them gently to the shingled roof on their stable. Lil slipped down to a rickety wagon filled with dung and caught the boy. Then she buried herself in the manure with him. An elderly man came along, slowly, huffing, pulling himself into the wagon, and then he slapped the reins once. The man driving the waste away became their escape. No one bothered him the whole way winding through the vast city. No one stopped him. Lil didn't care that it was rancid. It kept her from smelling Demeen. The boy also didn't complain. He had his own stenches to try to escape. Once out of the city, the wagon stopped at a small farm, where the man exited the wagon slowly, as he had climbed aboard. While he talked to the farmer about fertilizer, she and the boy climbed out the back and ran into the woods, dashing from the hiding place to hiding place. She was fairly certain they escaped the meager place unseen. Once they had run some time, the trees began to thicken, and the fields of the farm faded behind them. The trees were capped with leaves, glistening green, and she hated their color, hated the rays of sun peeking through in beams of warmth. The day was lovely, but she wished it were overcast. She began to hear bubbling water, so turned to follow the sound and came to a deep creek, winding through the wood merrily. They both dove in the water, reeking of putrescence. They washed as best they could, clothes and all. Lil scrubbed herself violently. She had to get clean. She kept at it long after the layer of filth was off her skin, her flesh still crawling with the torture of what had been done to her. She finally washed between her legs, crying, trying to wash away the memory, but she could not. The boy just sat, drying from his own bathing, on the bank, watching with those giant brown eyes of his. After everything else was strung out on branches to dry, she pulled off her nightgown and put on her Entha clothes. They stayed there only until the garments had dried to dampness before pulling everything back into their pockets. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and tied a knot in two corners, making a cloak, then left the gown. She felt the little boy take her hand when they started off again. She wanted to shove his hand away, but she couldn't. She felt so much hate, so much rage, so much she didn't know what to do with. He was the only one who could even begin to comprehend. She just couldn't hate him too. She looked down at him, and he didn't look back with compassion. He looked back with understanding and acceptance, and that meant more to Lil than anything ever had in all her life. It meant more than the Entha accepting her. It meant more than being Ty's daughter. She stopped walking and absorbed his face, and he stood and absorbed hers. She let all other thoughts fade away to nothing until there was only his eyes, and they stood there for almost an hour. And even when they stopped staring and started walking again, she still held his hand. Lil, the boy, wandered around, stealing food from random farms and towns and moving on. She couldn't sleep and couldn't think. She didn't want to feel. When exhaustion would force her to rest, she would wake up screaming from nightmares. He never spoke to her, and she never spoke to him, but they were closer than she'd ever been to anyone. How he slept so much she didn't know. She didn't mind. In some ways she was jealous, but in most ways she was glad he could sleep. She carried him most of the time, tied to her in a blanket. They would stop in the glades in the woods, and she would practice with her dagger, the Entha way to fight. She made a spear and a bow and some arrows without feathers at the end. She practiced with them too, until she was sweating and cursing, her anger still unrelenting. He would just sit and watch her, and he never tried to play or even wonder. They were inseparable.